Okay, it's 11 o'clock now, so let's start. So welcome everyone to our special webinar. Today we are very fortunate to have Professor Iwan Jaya Azis from Cornell University to talk about the COVID-19 crisis and the economic implication. His presentation is titled, "This Crisis is Different." And we are also very fortunate to have Professor Hal Hill from the Australian National University to chair the session and also to give his comment. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Hal. Silakan, Pak.
Thanks very much, Pak Acho, and welcome to this week's Indonesia Study Group seminar or webinar. It's a weekly series with the support of the Australian National University and Australian ADFAT. So it's 11 o'clock in the morning in Canberra on Wednesday. That means it's 8 o'clock in Jakarta. Selamat pagi di Jakarta and elsewhere in Java. It's 9 o'clock in Bali, 10 o'clock in Jayapura, and it's 9 p.m. yesterday, Tuesday, in beautiful Ithaca in upstate New York. And that is where this week's distinguished speaker is currently located. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Iwan Jaya Azis. He really needs no introduction. I'm going to give him one anyway, since he's a very good friend of ours. Iwan has spent most of his professional life at two very fine universities, University of Indonesia and Cornell University. He's a graduate of both universities. He's also a professor of economics at both universities, currently residing in Ithaca, but returning frequently to Jakarta, and also teaching currently, I think, in Jakarta at the Faculty of Economy. So Iwan's CV is far too long to read out, so I won't spend the entire 90 minutes reading it out, but just to mention, he continues to be a very prolific author. Two of his most recent volumes, books, Regional Economics, Fundamental Concepts, Policies and Institutions, and another one, somehow two recently, congratulations, Iwan. Mathematical Models for Economic Analysis, Selected Topics and Applications. I might also mention that Iwan is the lead author of the 2015 Springer volume, Managing Elevated Risk. That was also the topic of his 2016 art lecture when he was a distinguished visiting professor at the ANU. So Iwan's done lots of other things. One was a very senior position in the Asian Development Bank, but he's basically been an academic at these two institutions for most of his life. So Iwan, it's a wonderful pleasure to have you, and thank you very much for staying up rather late. Your time, and maybe just in case Ibu Irina is in the vicinity, welcome also to Ibu Irina, maybe she's somewhere nearby. So the rules of engagement, we have 90 minutes. So the way we will organize it is that Iwan will talk first. I've been asked to give some very brief comments. I might just mention we are greatly honored to have Yang Terhormat Professor Emil Salim, Emil Selamat Pagi, and we will take the liberty of inviting Emil to also make some remarks, and then we'll open it up for general conversation. So as usual with these seminars, please indicate you might have a question in the chat facility or by raising your hand. So without any further ado, Iwan, once again, great pleasure to have you. Thank you very much for joining us, and we're very much looking forward to your words of wisdom. Terima kasih banyak.
Thank you, Hal, and welcome to everyone who is joining this webinar. Unfortunately, the time is very short, and the topics or the issues are so broad. So let me try to just come into only 3 points. So I'm not going to talk more than 3 points. And the first point is about how we got here, in the sense that we know everybody now is talking about the COVID-19 crisis and so forth. But I try to give some background how we got here. Now, what do I mean by we? When I said we, I'm referring to the emerging market economies. So I'm not talking about any individual country. I'm not even talking about the world, but I'm talking about the emerging market economies, because that's the focus of my talk. And the second point is really about the crisis itself. And in a sense, that's really the core of the talk. That's the reasons why the title of the talk is "The Crisis is Different," because that's really the issue that I'm going to explore. And then the last point, this is like a speculation. So I put myself in a brave situation, that is to speculate what's going to happen. Okay. Now, of course, there's a lot of question. As a matter of fact, there will be more questions than answers. So that's why your participations will be most welcome. And I really appreciate if anybody can give me some inputs with regards to what's next. Okay. So let me quickly go to the first point. The conclusion of the first point is that emerging market economies were already vulnerable. So in other words, what we are observing now after the COVID-19 crisis, of course, everything is bad, everything going down south, growth is lower, unemployment increase, and so on. It's not only because of the COVID-19, because, you know, just imagine there are two systems, system A and system B, but if system A is less vulnerable than system B, even with the same shock, I think the outcome will be different. So the conclusion from my first point here is that emerging market economies were already vulnerable, even before the COVID-19 crisis here. Now, there are a couple of things that we need to understand. Now, I don't want to go too far back. Let's start from 2006, because ideally I could talk about the Great Depression. It's all related, but let's start from the 2006, and that is the year where the so-called global imbalance peak. Now, I'm aware that not all participants are really familiar with the concept of global imbalance. So let me spend just 2-3 minutes about global imbalance. Essentially, it's about imbalance between X number of countries and Y number of countries. X countries are those who experience surplus in their current account, whereas the Y countries are those countries who experience deficit. Okay, and since many, many years ago, since Roman Empire actually, there are always cases like that, always countries surplus and countries in deficit. So why then they call it global imbalance this time? What's so different this time? Well, what's so different is that out of all those Y countries that are in deficit, 70%, so 70% of the total deficit of all countries in deficit originate in one country. And that never happened in the history of the world. Usually, you know, it's spread out. Of course, there are some countries who are more deficit than the others, but never happened in the history of the world that only one country contributes 70% of the total global deficit. And that country is where I'm living now, the United States. In 2006, as I said, it reached the peak. Just to give you a proportion, in 2006, the current account deficit in the US reached as high as 7% of the GDP. This is way above what economists usually consider as a, you know, safe level. Okay? Anyway, long story short, because of global imbalance, and any imbalance has to be filled in, and the filled in is really the capital inflows. And that was really the story of massive capital inflows coming to the United States during that period. By the way, just another note, since my topic is about emerging market, I cannot not to mention about China, because out of the surplus, because I was talking about deficit earlier, out of the surplus, about half, almost half of the surplus from Asia. Okay, now, of course, we know the story of Asia was the story of China. And if you trace the origins of this dominance of China, basically it started in 2001, when they, for the first time, they joined the WTO. you can look at any sources of statistic. Trade in China since 2001, since they joined the WTO, shoot up. It's very, very sharp increase. And that contributes to the global imbalance as well. And as I said, 2006 reached the peak. Now, with massive deficit in the US, there is also massive inflows coming to the US. And we all know if there is a massive inflow, that pushes down the interest rate. Indeed, if you look at the trend of the world interest rate, especially the interest rate in advanced economies, including US, it's sharply going down. Okay. Now, from one side, you can see this is good for the US economy, indeed, because growth was very, very strong, a lot of credits. Most of those credits goes to the consumers' credits. And that's why US suffer from the excess consumption and deficit in saving. In fact, at one point, the household saving in the US was negative. Okay? But the main story is really a lot of credit goes to the housing market. Now, there are so many markets. Even within the housing market, there are so many levels. And of course, by now we know the culprit which led to the global financial crisis in 2008 was only one market, and that is called the subprime market. The reason why they call it subprime, because they're not prime. They're really, basically, the customers are really the low-income people, okay? Some people call it ninja, no income, no job, no asset. And that was really given a lot of credit due to the capital inflows here. Now, we know the story, and I don't want to sort of elaborate because that's not the topic. But my point here is that because of the global imbalance, there is global financial crisis in 2008. But what is the connection with the emerging market? Well, the connection of the emerging market is not the FC itself, but the policy response. So this is what I personally felt that there's too many mistakes made by connecting the GFC and the growth of the emerging markets. I think it's not the GFC itself. GFC is the event, but the policy response that has a major impact on the emerging market economies. Of course, I'm talking about capital flows. When interest rate in the advanced economies, including the US, was so low, a lot of capital moving to the emerging markets. And this is interesting. There are three phases here. Phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. In phase 1, most of these capital inflows to emerging markets, they enter through the door of the banking sector. That's why I call it bank-led flows, because most of the flows goes to the banking sector. Why? Because it was driven by low interest rate in the US. But then we all know by 2009, the US adopted the QE policy, quantitative easing policy. Then we moved to the phase 2. But this time, the capital inflows going to the emerging markets enter the different door. It's no longer the banking sector, but the capital market. That's why I call it debt-led flows, because mostly going to the bonds market, equity market, and so forth. So phase 1, bank-led flows. Phase 2 is the debt-led flows. The question now is, what is phase 3? Well, phase 3, I call it the turbulent years for the emerging markets. Now, the reason is because what happened in phase 2 is not only the massive capital inflows going to the capital market, but many of the private sector in emerging market started to do what they did in 1996 that led to the Asian financial crisis. I'm talking about borrowing. There's a lot of borrowing, especially by the corporate sectors. A lot of borrowing done in phase 2. And then, of course, we know in 2013, which is the beginning of phase 3, in 2013, there is a major event. By now, it's called the Taper Tantrum. Now, in that event, basically, there's a lot of volatility in the financial market, capital outflow from emerging market and so on. But then it was only brief, took only a year or two. After that, back to quote-unquote normal. What I found it interesting is that despite the fact that there was warning from 2013 event, what we call the Taper Tantrum, the private debt continued to surge. And that led to the vulnerability in emerging markets. If I may share with you just one chart, this is the chart I was referring to. So the phase one is really the bank-led flows. Phase two is the debt-led flows. And phase three, what I call the turbulent years. There's a lot of pro-cyclicality, there's a lot of flow reversal, there's a lot of volatility. And during that phase three, the vulnerability was built up in emerging market economies. And of course, that lasted until last year. So the story in emerging market before the COVID-19 crisis is a story about phase one and phase two and phase three. And unfortunately, the story ended up with vulnerability. And most of the sources of the vulnerability is coming from the behavior of the private sectors with a lot of debt, similar to what happened in 1996. Now, some wonder why then there was no sort of significant sign of vulnerability before the COVID-19. In fact, we know a lot of media was talking even highly about emerging market economies. This is where I personally think there's a big difference between what I call the measured risk and the hidden actual risk. And we all know in finance, there's a lot of hidden risk, there's a lot of actual risk which is not measured in standard indicators, because we know in finance there's a lot of standard capital adequacy ratio, loan to value ratio, and so forth. But those are the measured risks, and that's why it's almost like giving you the false sense of security. Now, of course, when you are in that position, you don't see it until there is a trigger. So the real test of the system was really if there is a trigger. And of course, we know the trigger was the COVID-19. So again, if I may repeat, the conclusion from first part of my presentation is that emerging market economies was already vulnerable even before the COVID-19 crisis. So now let me move to the second point, and that is about the COVID-19 itself. This is very different. If we look at the impact itself, essentially, the world economy is in coma now. It's not dead yet, but it's in coma now. And I cannot think of, at least not in my lifetime, I cannot think of, because I was not born during the Great Depression. In my lifetime, I never seen that the world economy reached this point. Now, of course, we know the story is much more complicated than standard economic story like what I was telling you the last 10 or 15 minutes, because this is an interaction between public health crisis and economic crisis. And there's a lot of unknown, there's a lot of uncertainty here. So one thing that is sure, what we know, what we observe is that the impact was severe, much more severe than any crisis that I've seen. Definitely much more severe than global financial crisis of 2008. But of course, it's not only about severity, but also about the nature of the impact of this COVID-19 crisis here. There are two types. The standard type of impact, I'm talking about standard economic impact like high unemployment, slowing growth, bankruptcy, high debt, and so forth. Those are pretty standard. But more seriously is the non-standard impact. And I'm talking about human life. How many people died because of this crisis? Even those who still survive, how many of the millions of them are really becoming non-productive, either because of illness or because they cannot work, because of the lockdown, because of work at home, and any restriction that has been imposed by almost all countries, especially in emerging markets. So this is something that is different. And as a result, we can see that the fall of supply and demand happens simultaneously. Usually, in any crisis, there's almost like sequence. The demand first, and then the supply start. And even that, the drop, take for example, global financial crisis. the fall in the supply side, of course it was there, but it's not as severe as now. Why? For simple reason, because now there's a lot of restriction. Now there's a lot of containment, and it hits the global value chain, global supply chain, and people cannot work. Even in the agriculture sector, I'm more concerned with the agriculture sector. Actually. I cannot imagine how many farmers, even in the US, who cannot go to work because of the containment and everything. And that leads to all kinds of multiplier effects, which is ugly, which is nasty. Okay? So from that standpoint, it is different. We cannot just talk about the impact of this crisis from the economic standpoint, purely economic, because the impact is all connected to health issues. Now, given this, if we are just looking at what happened in terms of the policy response, again, there are two types of policy response, the standard one, and I call it the non-standard one. The standard one, we all know, fiscal policy, monetary policy, regulatory policy. Every country, every emerging market economy is conducting the same policy, stimulus packets. Okay? They are trying to create, to enhance the unemployment benefits. They try to help the middle income and low income group. They provide more subsidy for all kinds of utilities like electricity and so forth. All countries are doing the same thing. They may be different in terms of the size and also in terms of the implementation, because when it comes to implementation, things getting more complicated because it all depends on the institutional quality of each country. Excuse me. Monetary policy is the same thing. All countries doing the same thing, lowering the interest rate, lowering the reserve requirement, making it more easy. The focus in the monetary policy is really to provide liquidity. You know, every country is different, but the direction is all the same. Regulatory is the same thing. You know, I know some emerging markets allowing flexibility in terms of the reporting reporting procedures for the banking sector as well as non-bank financial sector. So all of these things are really focusing into sort of how to make sure that the economy has enough liquidity. All the same. Those are the standard. We can always argue for different country having different type of fiscal policy, but essentially they're all the same. What is the non-standard one? This is really what makes this crisis different. The non-standard one, I cannot imagine in the past. Take, for example, global financial crisis. There was no restriction. There is no restriction that people cannot go to the office, people cannot go to the factory, people cannot go to the restaurant, and so forth. It's very different. And the multiplier impact is unimaginable. From that standpoint, one can think of no wonder the supply and demand evaporate almost simultaneously. As I said, in the past, usually there is a sequence. Here, it's simultaneously happening. Now, here the policy response, which is not standard, as I said, it's really different between countries. First, of course, the most important one, that is tests. Make sure that who's really infected and who is potentially infecting other people and who is not infected. So test. That's number one. All countries are doing it. Again, like in the case of fiscal and monetary policy, each country different in terms of the nature as well as the extent of the test. They're also doing some containment. Again, every country is different. Some are using the closed border. Some are really using the total lockdown. Some are using partial lockdown. But essentially, something which didn't happen in the global financial crisis in 2008. So from that standpoint alone, the title of this talk is already shown. this crisis is different. Now, of course, one can always argue, and I feel pity of all those people who policy makers who really work hard trying to resolve this unprecedented new territory, basically unprecedented event, new territory, and there is no roadmap, basically. You know, if you're even global financial crisis, I remember in my book about global financial crisis, I mentioned that this is unprecedented. Yes, it's true. In 2009, global financial crisis was unprecedented. It was the only comparable thing is really the Great Depression in 2000. But now, global financial crisis, it's almost like nothing compared to the current crisis. This is the real unprecedented thing. So from the policymakers' point of view, this is very hard because there is no roadmap. Okay? Again, as I said, supply and demand evaporate almost simultaneously here. What we can discuss is really about what is the approach. In terms of the policy, it's difficult. There's no roadmap. So here is my personal opinion, which I would really like to be criticized. Maybe this opinion was wrong. If we look at this unusual containment combined with, you know, falling output, increased unemployment, increased poverty, increased debt, and so forth, isn't it better if we now try to just separate those workers who are still able to work, meaning they're not infected, and those who are infected? My point here is that I don't know what's the number. Let's say 70% are not infected, 30% are infected. Maybe the 70% can and should continue to work. Okay. And once it's done, then the unit of operation, whether it's bank or companies or big companies or SME or farming industry and so forth, then they should receive the stimulus package. They should be helped by the government, by the policymakers. Okay? So at least we know that certain activities can still operate safely in the sense that there is no risk of being infected, and yet they are in trouble, and that's why they need to be helped. You know, like fiscal, monetary, regulatory policy, and so forth. Now, of course, we don't know when it's going to end, and that's my third topic later, actually. But at least if we can separate those workers who still continue to work, and then that operation is helped by stimulus package, I can still see at least the economy will not be in coma. Okay. However, I know it's easy for me to say sitting here. In practice, it's not easy. Why? Because the precondition for that is test. I said earlier, 70% of people are not affected, 30% are affected. How do I know? How can any government knows 70% and 30%? The answer is test. But if the level or the coverage of the test is so minimal, then forget what my idea earlier. So again, let me repeat. Policy response is all the same in emerging markets. Standard and non-standard. The standard one is fiscal, monetary, regulatory. The non-standard one is containment, you know, working at home and things like that. But if we put them together, maybe sequence matter. So the sequence should be test first, test. Once it's clear, then we can start with stimulus package. Another way to argue is that, what about if we reverse stimulus packets and later the test? I'm afraid if that is the case, I'm just imagining, suppose I have a company, okay, and my company is in trouble because of the crisis. But then, thank God, I received a stimulus package. So I'm ready to operate with that stimulus package. But I don't have workers who can work because my workers either they are infected or they are afraid to come to the office because they are afraid to be infected. Why? Because there's no test. So you can see it from that angle actually to really appreciate the importance of the sequence here. Okay. So that is essentially things that makes this crisis different than in the past. Let me mention the last point about the second topic about the difference here. And I'm talking about contagion. No, I'm not talking about the health contagion. I'm not talking about illness contagion. I'm talking about economic contagion. This is what drove my interest to see what is the difference between contagion in 2008 crisis and the contagion now during the COVID-19 crisis. So what we did, we tried to look at least 10 countries in Asia, including Indonesia. And then we look at least 5 different asset classes. For example, we are looking at bonds market 10 years, bonds market 5 years, equity market, money market, and foreign exchange market. So we are looking at this. Okay, it's still going on, but maybe I can share with all of you our tentative conclusion. It shows that, as expected, this crisis, the spillover, the severity of the spillover and the severity of the contagion, it's much, much larger than the severity in the global financial crisis. If I may show you just one chart here. This is the shock spillover. The top chart is really during the global financial crisis. The bottom chart is during the current COVID-19 crisis. I mean, you don't need to look at the mathematics of the number and so, just look at the chart itself. You can immediately say that this global financial crisis, the spillover and the contagion is much, much more severe. The interconnectedness is much more severe. Now, for those who are curious, those circles not only representing countries, but also representing those 5 asset classes that I mentioned earlier. Bonds market 10 years, bonds market 5 years, equity market, money market, and the foreign exchange market. Okay. Now, this is the chart showing the spillover of the shock. So, for example, if there's a shock in, I don't know, in the US, for example, bonds market in the US, how it transmits into all Asian countries, including Indonesia. By the way, Indonesia is, I think, the magenta color. Well, I'm not sure how it appears in your screen. Here in my screen, it's magenta color. Maybe in your screen, it's brown color. That's on the middle bottom. That's Indonesia. But for those who are really, studying the financial market, what matters is not only the shock, but also the volatility. So we try to calculate the volatility and the chart showing similarly. So this is the volatility basically. You can imagine the contagion and the spillover comparing the global financial crisis and the current crisis is much more severe, much more interconnected. Okay. So why don't I stop there for topic number 2, and now I'm going to move to the last topic. And the last topic is about the external condition. The sad part here is that, of course, the coronavirus itself is a sad story, but the sad part in addition to that is that global environment now, it's not really conducive. So it's much less benign compared to the previous crisis, even compared to 2008, okay? Synchronous slowdown is happening. China lift up, no possibility, because in 2008, at least the world can rely on how China can lift up the economy, because China was really, at that time, was really the one that maintained the high growth, and that lift up many other countries around the world. This time, no, because China is also slowing down. Of course, all of us know protectionism is on the rise, trade war is on the rise. But on top of that, institution is also global. I'm talking about global institution. There is no global leaders now. Okay? No fundamental structural changes since global financial crisis. And unfortunately, the sad story is that whatever infected at the global level, it's also infected at the regional level. And also it's infecting the national level. I'm talking about institution here. Geopolitical uncertainty. And last but not least is cooperation. You know, when I mentioned about the spillover, the contagion, the main purpose of cooperation, whether it's global cooperation or regional cooperation, is precisely to minimize the impact of contagion. And I mentioned earlier, during this crisis, the contagion is much more severe. So logically, this time, the demand for regional cooperation is also much higher. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. So again, this is my personal opinion. Maybe some of you disagree with me, but the way I see it, global and regional cooperation, it's not working. Okay. In fact, to some extent, they are even in disarray. I'm not only talking about financial cooperation, not only talking about economic cooperation, I'm also talking about environmental issues. Of course, we heard about the WHO. We heard about the WTO also, are all not in a good shape at this moment. So this is really unfortunate. You know, first of all, the crisis itself is so severe, unprecedented, but the external condition is not really helpful at this moment. Now, if we look at the, you know, every time we discuss about this current crisis, the $6 million question is, when is going to be over, right? I mean, everybody is always interested with the prospect. Well, if you look at the prospect, then the only argument that I can make is the following. It all depends, number one, whether the sequence that I was talking earlier is really in place. Test, stimulus package, okay? Number two, it's really something that is beyond economics, and that is about the virus itself. We don't know when the vaccine is going to be available. We don't know when the cure is going to be available. So all this uncertainty makes it almost impossible for anyone to predict when it's going to be over. Even if they can predict when it's going to be over, no one can predict with high degree of precision about how much is the growth next year or in 2022. Okay, so almost all existing forecasts, I'm sorry to say, even forecasts made by the international organizations, I cannot buy it. I mean, I will look at those forecasts with high degree of doubt that they are going to be right. Okay. Now, of course, depending on which organizations you're looking at in terms of their forecast, but most of the forecasts that I read, the shape of the recovery will be V-shaped. It's hard for me to agree with that, precisely because of the second point that I was explaining earlier. You know, take for example the labor market. I cannot imagine. You know, this is the way I see the problem. Most of economists still see this as a regular economic crisis. And because they see this as a regular economic crisis, they think in terms of the economic policy, you know, the standard unemployment, you can overcome the unemployment with the injection, with the stimulus package and so on. I'm afraid this is going to be very different. I mean, just think about one possibility, scaring. You know, in labor market, there's a concept of scaring. If people cannot go to work for a long period of time, they will lose their skill. And what does it mean? That means they cannot be going back to the work. So that means even though at the beginning, I know like in this country, in the US, they split the unemployment into two groups. One is the temporary unemployment and the permanent unemployment. I'm afraid even among the temporary unemployment, many of them will become permanent. Okay, so in other words, I think we need more than just standard economic policy response to deal with this current crisis here. Okay, so essentially what I'm trying to say here is that any forecast, especially the V-shaped recovery forecast, it's doubtful, at least to me. So I'm happy to hear if there are some of the participants disagree with me and see the potential of V-shaped recovery. Most of the argument that I heard about the V-shaped recovery is because of the low base, because the drop was so severe so that it will be V-shaped. Yes, I buy that kind of a standard argument, but given the fact that the effect can be long-term, I just gave you just one market, that is labor market. The effect will be long-term, and some of them, in fact, a lot of them will be permanently unemployed. I'm afraid it's not going to be V-shaped. Okay, so that is my take in terms of the prospect here. Here is all kinds of possibility of recovery that you like. Okay, of course, everybody would like to have the upper right, which I circle with the green one. That's the V-shape. Everybody wants that. But to get that, you have to have two things. Your economic policy has to be effective. That's the column. And there has to be rapid and effective control on the virus itself. That's on the row side. Okay. My take is that I think it's going to be either the yellow or the red one. Of course, it differs from country to country, but it's unlikely to be the red one. But I know most of the international organizations make a forecast like the upper right one. Most of them is predicting there will be V-shaped recovery. Let me close by saying the following. Given the unprecedented nature of this crisis, there are a lot of things that we don't know than what we know. Okay? And that makes it very difficult to make a precise forecast here. Just one example, we don't know when or if a vaccine will be available or a cure will be available. We don't know when we can congregate and cheer again in public places. We don't even know whether Hal and I, or Pak Emil, or whoever teacher here, can teach in a regular way. Okay? We know this semester, none of us are really teaching in a regular way. We have to teach online. Okay? Whether it's going to be continue in the future, we don't know. Okay? But the most scary one, to me at least, what we don't know is that we don't know when it's going to end. Why this is important? Because just put yourself in the shoes of business sector. How can you make a plan, your business plan, if you don't know when it's going to be ending? Yeah. That's the most scary one. Okay. Now, of course, with all those sound, I don't mean to be negative, but with all those not so sort of promising points that I just mentioned, let me close by something that is a little bit positive. Okay. Unfortunately, I cannot be optimistic. I can be hopeful. Okay, so there's a difference between optimistic and hope. At least to me, hope implies that I don't have control. Okay, if I said I'm optimistic, that means I'm confident things is going to be better because I know what I need to do. I'm in control. But unfortunately, many of us are not in control, and that's why I prefer to use the word hope rather than optimistic. And what is that? To me, all this unprecedented event will lead to a major change in human behavior. And I'm talking about behavior in a broad sense, not only in economic sense. I'm talking about the behavior of human being in terms of how to treat the nature, how to treat the environment, how to treat each other, and also about the trust towards institution, the trust towards fellow citizens, and so on. Hopefully, this major shock will lead to change in the behavior. Of course, I hope the change is for the better, not for the worse. Okay? So with that, why don't I stop here, and I would like to listen to your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Iwan. If we had sound here for everybody, there would be a ringing applause from the 360 participants we have. We can't do that, but let me, on behalf of everybody, thank you for a most illuminating and comprehensive talk. I've been asked to actually make some comments, but I'll keep them very brief because there are a lot of people participating who I think will be able to contribute. So just a few very quick notes. The topic of the title of Iwan's talk is of course appropriate. This crisis is different. In a sense, it's really linking to the seminal Reinhard Rogoff book and many other studies like it. The word unprecedented has become part of our vocabulary daily, and it is in Iwan's story. It's a health crisis that became a financial and an economic crisis. It's global, unlike the Asian financial crisis and the global financial crisis, in which, of course, we know China was a key strong economy throughout that period. As Iwan also mentions, this time a major concern is we don't have yet any signs of clear global cooperation, especially amongst the major economies. Every country, in a sense, is sort of on their own. Now, I guess quite a bit of the conversation may focus on Indonesia. So just a few remarks about Indonesia. As Iwan says, we really are in the dark. We don't have yet a lot of information. We only have first quarter national account statistics. So the crisis effects are really coming through this current quarter. We don't really have a comprehensive picture of the health situation, although we have, of course, various indicators. One way of thinking about it, again, as Iwan mentioned, is to think about some of the pre-crisis vulnerabilities for any country. In the case of Indonesia, I think the evidence is pretty clear that in macro terms, Indonesia was relatively well prepared for it in the sense that it has had prudent macroeconomic policy. Of course, that's an outgrowth of the Asian financial crisis and lessons learned. If there were some vulnerabilities, they may be to do with the fact that there's still quite a large foreign holdings of government bonds, maybe the health sector where there's been, I guess you would say, historic underinvestment, and it's very hard to flick the switch on the health sector in that situation. If you think going forward, what should we focus on? Well, again, Iwan's laid out the scenarios beautifully, diagrammatically, as Iwan always does very clearly. I guess it's the case that governments, and we have to think of Ibu Sri Mulyani having and Perry having such difficult jobs at the moment. There's a short-term dimension, a medium-term dimension, and a long-term dimension. And the short-term dimension is just to basically try and keep the economy afloat as much as possible, both for households and for enterprises. That means, in a sense, throwing everything at the crisis, in a fiscal sense and in a monetary sense, the kinds of things that the Indonesian government has already started doing with the expanded fiscal deficit and with Bank Indonesia being very active in maintaining liquidity. Then the medium-term strategy, which of course is really only after you've got over the worst of it, and we don't know, as Iwan says, when that's going to be. The medium-term strategy is to think post-COVID how to restart the economy quickly. And probably, as Iwan says, that's really only going to happen when we have an effective vaccine, which doesn't yet look to be in prospect. And then there are the longer term issues. And that's if you use the saying "never waste a good crisis." Can we talk about scenarios in the future where there will be major policy reform? We know that reform is difficult for governments, but often crises, if there is a silver lining in them, it is that governments really are emboldened by these crises. A couple of other points just to mention. It's thinking about the global dimensions, as Iwan mentioned. It is really quite striking that the International Monetary Fund has not been centre stage, at least for countries like Indonesia. We know the reasons for that, but that's part of the international architecture. It also relates to the regional architecture, that is the Chiang Mai Initiative, CMIM. Where are these crucial regional and global initiatives? So one question to think about. Another question, I guess, is learning from countries which so far seem to have managed the crisis moderately effectively. And there one thinks of South Korea, of Republic of Korea, of Taiwan, Denmark, also Australia, New Zealand. Within Southeast Asia, ASEAN, my impression is that Singapore has handled it pretty well, apart from the special and troubling case of the migrant workers. Thailand, in spite of having a very large tourism sector and movement of people, seems to have also acted fairly quickly and effectively. And as far as we can tell, so too has Vietnam. So there are questions of can we learn from how some countries seem to be managing it better than others. Okay, with those brief remarks, I now want to turn it over. We have about 40 minutes for discussion, for Q&A. That can be through the facilities of the raising your hand or through the chat facility. But we have some very distinguished guests with us, and I'd like to first of all invite them. Pak Emil Salim is with us. Pak Emil, selamat pagi. We're greatly honoured to have you with us. And I wonder, Pak Emil, would you like to make a few remarks? Terima kasih.
Silakan Pak Emil.
Silakan Pak Emil.
Pak Emil, you're still muted, Pak.
Perhaps, Pak Emil, we will come back to you. This is the joys of doing live webinars. We're not quite sure whether you're hearing us or not. So
it seems Pak Emil is frozen. I mean, if I look at the video, it's frozen.
It's frozen. Pak Emil, we will come back to you shortly, if that's okay. Some other people I notice participating. My good friend Stephen Granville from the Lowy Institute, formerly Reserve Bank of Australia. Steve, would you like to come in and make some remarks? Steve Granville. We're not having a great deal of success. So I think in that case, let's just throw it open to the general audience. We can take Q&A, we can group them together, or we can take them individually. Let's see how many there are. Okay, so the floor is now open, as it were, figuratively speaking, for comments and questions. Who would like to start?
Hi, Pahal. While waiting for people to raise their hands, let me read some questions from the Q&A. So there is a question from Chandra Kusuma. He is wondering whether now is the time to rethink or remodel the financial and regional integration. That's first question. And then there's a question from Heath McMichael from DFAT. He agrees that the capital flows story is very important, but he is also wondering about is there important trade flows story related to this crisis. And relevant to that, Colby RD also asks, will we see more protectionisms around the world? That's two set of question.
So, Iwan, would you like to respond to some of those questions? I'm struck, for example, by the first question about regional integration, especially since you were running the Asian Development Bank's Regional Economic Cooperation Integration Office for some years. Thanks.
Okay, well, we can see things from different angle here. Let's start from the angle of the plus and the minuses of having high integration. Of course, we know all the pluses. I mean, economists have been well trained about the pluses of having integration and so on. But unfortunately, not so much about the downside of the high integration. And so my general comment is that when we look at the integration, we have to use the balanced view. We cannot just rely on the plus side of it. Well, there are many stories of the negative side. In fact, when there was a natural disaster hit Thailand, we know the story about what happened in global regional supply chain in Asia at that time, because Thailand was really the center of the global supply chain in the region at that time. And then we know in global financial crisis, the spillover and the contagions of the financial sector is also very severe. And I was just telling you that in the current crisis, even though I'm not finished yet with the study, but it shows already that it's much more severe in terms of spillover. So all in all here, invite further regional cooperation, because again, let me just use the case of the financial cooperation, because I happens to be familiar with that. This is really the time for regional cooperation, like what Hal mentioned about the CMIM and so forth. Unfortunately, we didn't see it. Now, of course, it all depends on how we predict in the future. Maybe because this is unprecedented, maybe because this is very different, there will be more sort of concrete cooperation. I hope so. I really hope so. But if you force me to put money on it, then I'm not ready to say that it's going to happen. Okay, but normatively, yes, I hope so, because this is really the time. As I mentioned earlier, contagion is much more severe. Any cooperation is basically, the goal is to reduce the impact of contagion. So cooperation is not to help individual country, because individual country have their own sovereign, they have their own policy. So the main purpose of the cooperation is really precisely to deal with this type of contagion. Okay, so my response is along that line, Hal, with respect to the regional cooperation.
Thanks, Iwan. On Heath McMichael's question about whether we can kind of disentangle the financial flows and the trade flows, especially merchandise trade. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, to some extent, yes, we can, but not entirely. Let me mention, yes, we can first, and then I'll mention, but not entirely later on. If you look at even before the COVID-19, if you look at the growth, so usually people compare the growth of the world commodity trade and the growth of the economy. I think the last 2 years has been declining, right? Yeah. And this was itself is already unprecedented, because usually the growth of the trade is higher than the economy. But now with the COVID-19, it's not only declining, it's negative. It's even worse in terms of the trade itself. Okay, but I'm not ready to say you can completely separate trade and finance. Let me just give you one clear example, and that is trade finance. You cannot really conduct import and export activities if you don't have access on the trade finance. And the 2008 and 2013 episode already give us a big lesson. Even though the crisis was really in financial crisis, but it hits the trade. Why? Among other things, because there's a dry up in terms of the trade financing. So you cannot really entirely separate trade and financing.
Yeah. Thanks, Iwan. I certainly agree. So now on my list, just to indicate, I think I'm going to invite, first of all, Puspa Amri, and then it's Chris Manning, and then it's Budi Reso Sudamo. Just to mention also that if Emil, if you can come back in, please do let us know. And similarly for Steve Granville. So,
can you hear me now, Hal? Can you hear me now?
We can indeed, Steve. So
Okay.
let me invite you now to contribute. Thanks, and good to have you.
Oh, look, thanks very much. What a terrific session this is. I'm really enjoying it, and great to see some of my longtime friends here. Roland Raja and I are doing a paper on COVID and Indonesia at the Lowy Institute, so I hope you'll keep an eye out for that. It's only a week or so away. And I could just perhaps say, just very briefly, the message that we've got there. First of all, it's clearly a global crisis, but Indonesia has one extra problem. The other countries have two problems. They have a health problem, and they have a problem of making sure that their economies are going fast enough. But in addition to that, Indonesia has the old problem of open capital markets and sudden stops of capital flow. Now, one of the problems is that there's a conflict between what you would like to do to handle the open capital markets problem and the problem of what you want to do for the domestic economy. The normal IMF endorsed role when you have a problem of capital outflow is to raise interest rates, but particularly to tighten fiscal policy. Let the exchange rate float. That's the usual IMF answer. Now, it seems to me that that's directly contrary to what Indonesia has to do at the moment, because Indonesia's greater problem is in fact the problem of a weaker economy and the need to run a much bigger fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficits are now normal around the world, but Indonesia's planned fiscal deficit is really quite small, with the deficit going from perhaps 2 or 3% of GDP up to 6% of GDP. This compares with Thailand, which is increasing its deficit by around 10%. And South Korea also, big deficit. So what can Indonesia do? The problem is always funding. The first problem is to do something about the capital flows, the capital outflows. And Indonesia seems to have handled those really brilliantly. Instead of tightening fiscal policy, they let the exchange rate fall, they let the yields on bonds go up a bit, and so the foreigners actually were penalised for leaving. And those who are staying have the prospect of the exchange rate rising in the future and yields falling, and they'll make capital gains on both of those things. So in terms of the second problem of capital outflows, I think Indonesia is on top of that. It's still, of course, a problem in the background. But what it means is that Indonesia should focus mainly on the problem of getting a big enough fiscal deficit so that it can handle the problem of a greatly slowing economy and very many people in serious trouble of having no income. So what can Indonesia do to fund the fiscal policy which they currently intend? In other words, going from about 2 or 3% up to perhaps 6% GDP. Indonesia is completely on its own on this one, I'm afraid. The rich countries are so self-absorbed that there's almost nothing they can do. As far as the IMF goes, as I've suggested, the classic IMF policies are in effect inappropriate for the Indonesian situation. So their policies are inappropriate, and because of the stigma, the long-term stigma, there's no way that Indonesia can look to the IMF. So it's on its own, very largely on its own. What are other countries doing when they need this kind of fiscal funding? Well, they're all turning to their central banks, and they're all doing something which has really been very unpopular, very dangerous in the past. They've been getting their central banks to fund the larger budget deficits. And I think what we're coming to understand is that if the situation is serious enough, this is something that you should do. So looking at it from the point of view of looking at the seriousness, the need for a big fiscal deficit, can I urge Indonesia and Bank Indonesia in particular to accept that this is perhaps once in a generation problem, and that sometimes you have to break the old rules about central banks not funding budget deficits. We know the history of this, that it's often turned out badly. Everyone remembers Germany in the 1920s, but of course Indonesia itself went through an experience of this in the 1960s, where the central bank funded the budget deficits. But in these unusual circumstances, there seems to me to be a strong case for doing it. And the important thing, if you're doing it for a special reason, a special temporary reason, is to make sure the exit strategy is in place. So Bank Indonesia, of course, should be cautious in taking on the job of funding a bigger fiscal deficit. But you can do that as a short-term consideration, while at the same time putting in place various checks and balances that make sure that in the longer run, Bank Indonesia isn't seen as a milch cow to automatically be looked at to solve Indonesia's problems. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Steve. Very important comments. Iwan, I'd like you to perhaps come back, but for a moment, I want to check. I think we may have Pak Emil with us again. Pak Emil, if we have you with us, would you like to speak?
That first, I consider the COVID-19 a wake-up call. One, that suddenly, because of stopping the mobility of the people, transportation dropped. Suddenly, the blue sky in Jakarta returned. The air is much cleaner now because of the lockdown, of the closing of the transportation. One. The other side is that the environmental impact, that suddenly we know that water becomes very important and for washing hands and so on and so forth. So there's an environmental issue that can solve because of COVID-19. Suddenly the public is aware about the transportation problem, pollution on the air, the importance of water for washing hands, which from now is taken for granted. That is the positive element of this COVID-19. Point two, the social aspect. Suddenly, the government realized, and all of us realized, that development is not pro-poor. Those that have suffered most in this COVID-19 are the poor. We have 514 districts in 34 provinces and 514 districts. 102 of them are green, meaning no COVID. But the rest of it, 80% of our districts are hurt by this COVID-19. So the resilience of the people are weak. Those that are suffering are those that require social safety nets are the poor, and that is still growing, continuously growing and hurting it. Social safety nets is in place, but growing also.
Pat Emil, I think we have lost you, I think, momentarily, I hope. Hello. Pat Emil, we may have to come back to you, I think, if you don't mind. We've lost you. With apologies, I might move on. Iwan, if you wouldn't mind, would you please perhaps store those important comments from both Emil and Steve? I'm conscious that we've only got 20 minutes left and we've got a bit of a queue, so I'd like to perhaps gather a few more questions if you don't mind. And we have on our waiting list, very patiently waiting, Puspa and Chris Manning and Budi. So Puspa, can we can you please now comment? And from now on, please, could everyone keep their comments fairly brief, just so we can maximise participation. Thanks very much, Puspa.
Thank you, Professor Hal. Thank you, Professor Iwan. You said earlier that there is a lack of public goods in terms of international cooperation. What would you say about the initiative of the Federal Reserve in providing and enlarging its swap lines? Do you have a sense of how much that has helped emerging markets, including Indonesia? Thank you.
Thanks, Puspa. Next, can I go to Emil? Are you back with us now?
Yeah. So,
would you like to resume your comments? Thank you.
Yeah. So one is the environmental aspect, that because of COVID, the blue sky is returning. So meaning that social works to prevent climate change. Second, social development teach us that we must focus on the poor. Distance learning, distance working assumes as if the poor knows about telecommunication use and so on, which is not the case. Side, please remember that Indonesia is an archipelago of which the nation spread out, and the development is very much Java, Sumatra, and Kalimantan heavy. So that development, because of COVID-19, creates an imbalance between East and West. And COVID-19 provides us, therefore, a way.
Yes. Good. Thank you very much, Emil. I think that they're very timely and important interventions. Iwan, if you don't mind, I'm going to now continue down the list just so everyone can have a say. Then I'll come back to you for the last 5 minutes, if that's okay. So next on my list is Chris Manning. Chris Manning in Jogja, please come in.
Okay, Pak, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you very much, Pak Emil. Wonderful and very informative talk. My question was on the labour market's effects, as you might expect, and in particular your comments about scarring and the long-term impacts on the labour market. And I wonder if you're not being a little bit premature. I do take it that there's huge disruption of the labour market and big effects that impact on poverty and living standards. But a few points that I've been thinking about is, first of all, huge differences between countries. I mean, the US, say, is just so totally different from, say, somewhere like Australia. So even amongst developed countries, and that holds also for developing countries, for China, for Vietnam, for Korea, for Taiwan, where I'd be surprised if the scarring effects are very large at all at present. Manufacturing hasn't been dramatically affected, as I understand it, and that many of the permanent workers are still engaged. That would be my comment, and I think that applies to some extent in Indonesia, where the effects have been very regional, very highly concentrated in Jakarta and around the industrial areas of West Java. But other parts of Java have actually not been that much affected, and particularly Central Java. East Java, I know, is a question mark in recent times. So my question is, maybe it's a wait and see on the longer term scarring effects of the labour market. I'm not quite as pessimistic as you are. And I wonder whether you might make a response in particular in regard to Indonesia. Thank you very much, Pak Iwan.
Thanks very much, Chris. Again, if you don't mind, Iwan, I'll hold you off for a minute. I know it's very difficult. So many interesting ideas coming at you. Next is Budi. Budi Reso in Canberra, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mas Iwan, for a very enlightening presentation. A broad coverage and a very deep. So as you mentioned that the key is this health sector, the recovery of health sector is an important aspect for the recovery of the economy. So while we're waiting until we know exactly whether the health sector and how the health sector could recover, it seems to me that the best things to do is to maintain the economy so that it not collapse directly. So then my question is that on the stimulus that every country has put, do you think that, well, just if, for example, take the Indonesian case, the proportional between investment on the health sector, investment on helping business, and investment on spending on social safety net, the proportion need to be corrected, or everybody has been using the same formula, so that is actually okay. So that the number one is that on the stimulus, is there, what do you have a formula that we actually putting the right portion of stimulus for each sector? Let's say that just 3 item: health, business as usual, and social safety net. The third, the second question is that this crisis also actually stimulate some sector to grow up faster, and particularly this IT technology. Yes, Pak Emil has mentioned that the infrastructure of IT technology in Indonesia has been limited, and in many developing countries. But if we look and we talk with our friends in region, even those who are in Eastern Indonesia, a lot of creativity has been happening. Yeah. So then, should actually the global world invest more on this IT robotics? So then, if the health sector is actually struggling in finding the vaccine for a while, we could actually compensate by new knowledge throughout this IT, robotic, and so on. And there should be an agreement between developed and developed countries so that the technology spread out a bit more even.
Okay, thanks, Bud. Iwan, you have a lot of really interesting questions. Do you want to just perhaps say a little bit about some of them? Please don't try and cover them all, because I'd like to have one more round of questions, if you don't mind, before we finish, which is now only in about 12 minutes' time. But Iwan, would you like to make any remarks so far on some of the many interesting questions?
Sure, quickly on Steve, thanks for the comment. I personally would like to always see the counterfactual. That's why I try to emphasize the source of the vulnerability in emerging market. Again, let me repeat, I'm not talking about any single country, in general here. So counterfactual, if during the phase 2, there was no surge of the private debt, I don't think emerging market will be in the current vulnerable situation. Not current, but pre-COVID-19 sort of vulnerability here. I agree with you that, you know, in some countries, again, I'm not mentioning any single country, in some countries, maybe it's better if they do almost like the opposite of what the IMF suggested. In fact, I remember when global financial crisis hit, what the US did exactly the opposite of what the IMF suggested Asia did. They lowered the interest rate as low as possible, even negative interest rate, and then they expand the deficit as much as possible. That was happening in the US in 2008, which is completely the opposite of what happened in 1997. But I like to see it as a counterfactual. And in that note, I would like to argue the following, Steve. Why don't instead of focusing on the medicine, which I agree with you, the medicine, if you are already in the current situation, maybe one way to do it is to lose the exchange rate and then, you know, expand the deficit and so forth, and let the central bank help financing the deficit. I cannot disagree with you on that. But instead of, because it can happen again, we don't know when, but it can happen again, right? So instead of focusing on finding the medicine, what about if we are trying to find way to prevent? So the prevention. And I cannot, not to mention about the case of Korea. I don't know, Steve, if you're aware about the case of Korea when in 2011 they imposed a levy. Essentially, they don't impose capital control. What they did is really, they were selective. So only the dangerous capital inflows, they try to put levy on it. So to me, that is an example of prevention, okay? I fully agree with what you just said, but that is medicine. I'm more interested in why don't we try to, of course, you cannot eliminate entirely, but at least minimize the potential similar things happen in the future here. Okay, that's my quick comment. Now, on other comments, Chris Manning, good point about the swap. Number two things, Chris. First of all, I'm not mentioning any single country. Definitely, I was not talking about Indonesia. But more importantly, Chris, I'm more worried not so much about the unemployment. I'm more worried about productivity. As you know, growth of the labor productivity in all emerging markets has been declining. In fact, I don't know if you read the Economist magazine, they have a special section mentioning about, this is like, they even use the word doom, the labor productivity in many developing countries and emerging markets has been slowing down. So I'm more concerned with that. And, scaring is, sometimes people relate with not possible to get another job. But even if they are still able to get the job, I think they will be less productive. Why? Because maybe it's mismatched, maybe they are less productive and so forth. So my comment is only that. But again, I'm not talking about Indonesia in general. Pak Emil, I cannot disagree with you more. You see it as a wake-up call. I love to use the same thing, but I'm embarrassed. Why? Because in 2008, after 2008 crisis, many times whenever I give a talk, I always said the same thing. 2008 is really a wake-up call and so forth. So I really hope, that's why I ended my talk earlier by saying hope rather than optimistic. So I really hope that we are all right, that the behavior, the human behavior after this COVID-19 crisis is over will be towards the better, okay? But unfortunately, we can stop only at the hope. So as a wake-up call, I agree. But 2008 was also a wake-up call. But look what happened. People did not change. Institutions did not change. At the global, regional, at the national level. I mean, when the crisis was over, they're going back to do what they did before 2008 and so on. The same thing in trade, in financial sector, and institution. Now, on Budi and others, a question here, because time is limited. Let me just mention this. We can always design with any policy. Of course, we can discuss in detail about the size of the policy, the money, or the focus or the orientation with the priority and so on. It's always like that. But I'm worried when we are talking about emerging market, which is our topic today, I'm worried that what is more important in emerging market is not the money, but the institution. You can have as much as money if you want. You can even have the beautiful, most optimal policy, but the outcome, unfortunately, is always stumbled by lack or low quality of institution. And when I'm talking about institution, I'm talking in general. I'm talking about the capacity, the administrative capacity, especially at the regional level, as well as at the national level and so forth. So the same thing about investment in health, I cannot disagree. That's why I said earlier, test. What does it mean? That means you need to invest more in the capacity, the public health capacity. For what? Among other things, for tests. Because if you can test more people, Hal mentioned about the success story. Singapore was the example. Why the case in Singapore is so high? Because they test. They test almost everybody there. So at least they know black and white now who is sick, who is not sick, who is infected, who is not infected, who is potentially infecting, and who is not potentially infecting and so forth. So in general, I think I agree the direction. That's why I said earlier, policy-wise, almost all emerging markets are doing the same thing. But the stumbling block in most emerging markets is really the institution, the low quality of institution.
Thanks, Iwan. We're almost out of time, but I would just like to squeeze in 3 more questions, please, to the questioners. Please keep your questions brief. So first of all, I have Vishnu at ANU. Secondly, I have Andy Conchoro from Department Keuangan.
Yeah.
And thirdly, I have Nancy Chung. I think Nancy, that's Nancy in Singapore, right? And the co-author with Rick of that wonderful book on the Stalin Group. So let me go to Vishnu first. Please, could you keep the questions very short now?
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. I just want to ask, so considering the COVID crisis hits labor-intensive sectors the most, and most likely this crisis will going on for a prolonged period, do you think this is the right time to consider applying universal basic income in facing the new normal? Thank you.
Thanks, Vishnu. Good question. Now to Andy in the hot seat, Department Keuangan, if you could briefly make a comment or question. Thank you.
Thanks, Hal Hill. I'm a big fan of yours. So I have 3 questions for my professor. So first is,
please briefly, if you don't mind, Andy.
Sure. So I have 3 questions. So how this pandemic shapes or continues the 4G period that Professor Iwan has delivered in the last 4 years in ANU when he delivered a lecturing. So how this pandemic shapes or continues the 4G period. So the second one is, if you have 100 as your fiscal resources, are you gonna allocate it mostly for real sectors or financial sectors? That's the second question. So the third question is, since in the case of Indonesia, we have a liquidity trap issue and shallow market of capital, are you still gonna choose financial sectors for allocation channel? That's all my question, Hal and Professor Iwan. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Very important questions. And maybe we can report back to your boss, Ibu Sri Mulyani, what Iwan says is the answer.
Sure.
Final question, I think, is from Nancy. Nancy Chung, I guess in Singapore. Nancy, please.
Hi, Hal. Actually, it's me, Richard.
Oh, it's Rick.
Hi.
You're masquerading under someone else's name, Rick.
Yes. Well, never mind that. The question.
I haven't seen you for about a decade. Welcome.
Yeah. Thank you. The question for Pa Iwan. Indonesia and some other emerging markets are bailing out, or let's say strongly supporting financially state-owned enterprises that are strapped now. Is it better to be using the money to support and extend the time of social safety nets and let state enterprises go under because they, in some cases, are a drag on the economy? Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. We miss you, by the way, not having you daily in the Wall Street Journal. So, Iwan, back to you just for a brief final wrap-up, if you wouldn't mind, please.
Okay, so there are 3 questions here. One is universal basic income. The concept is nice. The question is always we have to ask, how are we going to finance that? It's the same thing with the concept of the universal healthcare. I mean, it's always nice, but you have to think about how we are going to finance that, because we don't want to have the cases like in many countries, including in the US actually. The quality, one thing about having universal meaning that everybody is covered, but another thing about the quality, okay? So that's my quick reaction. For the question of 4G, yes, I didn't mention about 4G. Actually, there's 6G, not just 4G here. For the reason I think Andy mentioned about 4G, because my talk at the NU, the title was about 4G, because at that time, I didn't include the Great Depression, which is the first G, and I didn't include the Golden Age, which is the second G. I jumped into the Great Moderation in ANU. That's why I said 4G, Great Moderation, Global Imbalance, Global Financial Crisis, and Great Divergence. So the link, your question is what's the link between that and the current crisis? Well, I mentioned earlier, it started in 2006, which is the third G, which is the global imbalance there. And that leads to GFC, and that leads to capital flows. And that is the reasons why, I mean, my discussion earlier with Steve about the capital flows here. I personally believe it's better if we think about the prevention. So in other words, in a way like what Korea did. So, you know, we try to minimize all the potential impact of negative impact, all the potential negative impact of capital flows here, okay? So that's my reaction. Now, the second and the third question is similar between the question raised by Rich and Andy. What is the priority? To me, what is priority is the human. This is human crisis. This is human health. Health is number one. So it doesn't matter whether it's through the private sector, whether it's through this SOE, or whether it's through the financial sector, because Andy was asking whether real sector or financial sector. Those are only sectors. Those are only label. Think about the people, okay? Think about the people. And then if I may add what Pa Emil mentioned, who are the people? Majority. And who are the majority? Middle and low income. We are talking about emerging market economies here. So to me, when we come to the priority, those are the priority, okay? Economic and non-economic factors has to work together. This is, you know, I know it sounds cliche, multidisciplinary, but this is a real one. That's why I mentioned to Pa Emil earlier, I cannot agree more with the statement that is a wake-up call. But I'm embarrassed because every time we said the wake-up call, it didn't happen, okay? But this is the time for real concrete, not just lip service about the need of multidisciplinary. Economists have to be humble and have to learn from non-economists and vice versa, because this crisis is multidimensional, real multidimensional. Again, I'm saying this with a little bit embarrassed because in 2009, I said the same thing. 2008 was, you know, multidimensional crisis. How, I think, quick response is that?
Iwan, thank you very much for a stellar performance. Reluctantly, I'm going to have to bring the webinar to a close, partly, of course, because Iwan, it's now 10:30 p.m. Ithaca time. So, Iwan, on behalf of everybody, there would be a loud applause if we could record it, but we can't. But let me express our deep gratitude and thanks for such an insightful, illuminating presentation. In fact, the trouble is it's so good we want to have you back again, if you don't mind, sometime in the future. Let me also thank the questioners, lots of interesting questions and discussion. Let me particularly thank Pa Emil Salim for joining us. We're honoured by your presence, Pa Emil, and also the other discussants. And finally, let me thank the mighty ANU Indonesia project for again putting on such a wonderful event. And maybe now I hand back to Acho or Nuk. But again, Iwan, our deep gratitude. Thank you so much for a brilliant presentation. Thanks, and lovely to see you.
Thank you so much, Pa Hal and Pa Iwan. It's a really wonderful session, and thanks for everyone who attended this presentation. Those raised questions, and apologies for those whose question we cannot answer at this event. And just a little announcement, next week we will be talking about fiscal need and the financing the response to the COVID-19 in Indonesia, which is really relevant to Steve's point on the fiscal condition in Indonesia. And we will have the Deputy Minister of Finance, Professor Suhasil Nazara, and Professor Peter Macaulay. So stay tuned, and we'll see you next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everybody. And apologies to the people who we couldn't get to. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Iwan.
And goodbye from the south coast of New South Wales. Thank you.